Hey folks, this week saw the patch 12.07 PTR go to a release candidate. The significance of this is that the patch contents are pretty much now locked in, as Blizzard move away from weekly PTR updates to occasional hotfixes, and it also means that the release date for the patch will likely be announced in the next week or so. This did mean that the PTR build didn't have a lot of new additions or changes, but there were still a couple that did sneak in, one of which might well mean that you will need to change how you use your existing currencies, along with some possible relief for people struggling with repair costs. So stay tuned for that. But first of all, let's get back to the question of when this patch release date may turn out to be. There has been some speculation that it might well be later than the usual 8 weeks, due to a recent change to the schedule for the next outing of Turbulent Timeways. When it was first added, Turbulent Timeways was scheduled to run from June the 16th, which would be 8 weeks from the release of patch 12.05 through to August the 25th. But that has now changed to run from June the 30th through to August the 11th. So does that mean that patch 12.07 is being pushed back by a couple of weeks? Well, I already had some doubts about that, as patch 12.07 also has some updates for the Midsummer Fire Festival, which is due to start on June the 21st, along with the brand new Darkspear Dash, which is due to start on June the 27th, both of which are obviously well before that June the 30th date. Taking the timing of those holiday events into account and combining it with the timing of the move of the PTR to release candidate, overall, I'm pretty sure that patch 12.05 is going to be releasing on that 8-week boundary, which will be June the 16th for North America and June the 17th for the EU. In my experience of watching World of Warcraft PTRs, changes to the Turbulent Timeways schedule are pretty commonplace, and while some of those Turbulent Timeways events have aligned with patch release dates, some haven't at all. On top of that, the original end date of Turbulent Timeways on August the 25th, had it been the release date for patch 12.10 as was speculated at the time, that would have led to Season 2 and the Race to World First starting on September the 1st. This would have run the risk of clashing with BlizzCon, as that starts on September the 12th, and even if it did not end up clashing, participants and casters would pretty much have had to rush straight from the event to BlizzCon, which wouldn't have been very ideal for them. Because of this, I personally suspect that that first set of dates was nothing more than a copy and paste placeholder until the developers had a chance to decide on what the final schedule should be. As it is now, the new end date of August the 11th is 8 weeks after patch 12.07's suspected release date, and that would point to Season 2 starting on August the 18th. Almost a month before BlizzCon, which leaves plenty of time for the Race to World First to conclude and participants to get a bit of a break before the BlizzCon travel. As to why Turbulent Timeways now starts 2 weeks after the patch release date is likely to be, I think that is likely just to give us 2 free weeks to explore the 2 new patch zones, which will be alternating weekly, possibly in response to that player feedback about how patch 12.05 had for many people felt a bit. Now, I do plan to do a full in-depth preview video of the contents of the new patch, but it is worth saying that this patch is, I think, going to feel a lot less overwhelming, even though it still looks like there's a lot of content on paper. The reason for that is that 3 of the main features, including the new campaign questline, a new lore walking questline, and the new Janalai egg hatching questline, are just one-off pieces of content. In fact, the only new repeatable content is going to be those 2 zones, which, as I have mentioned, will be alternating weekly, meaning that we'll only have one to deal with at the same time. There is, of course, also Turbulent Timeways, but honestly, that's a pretty familiar event already, and it's much more focused in alts. Now, going back to those 2 new zones for a little moment, I think it is worth calling out that these are not going to feel like regular World of Warcraft zones. They are basically expanded versions of two of the Legion 730 invasion points, the icy world of Val and the fungal world of Nagtal. And while the latter of those two zones is quite a bit bigger than the Siren Isle, Val is, if anything, a little bit smaller. Gameplay wise, they will feel like regular zones with side quests, world quests and even world bosses. And yes, that does mean we're getting 2 new world bosses in the next patch. But entering these zones will involve going through this difficulty selection screen, where we can choose between normal or yes, heroic world mode. And this does make these zones feel a lot more like an instance than part of the open world. And overall for me, the zones do feel more like a kind of hybrid scenario in open world zone. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out with the wider player base. That heroic world mode, by the way, is pretty challenging. The recommended item level is 274, and added this week is a new pop-up that recommends going in as a group of at least 3 players if your item level is lower than that 274 mark. But don't worry, this requirement isn't being enforced by the game, so if you really want to go in solo, you still will be able to. That recommended item level is only slightly below a fully upgraded hero gear set. And during my testing, I did go in solo on an item level 279 tank, and my experience was that while the enemies didn't take me any longer to defeat them, the amount of incoming damage was very high indeed. So much so that I had to pay just as much attention to my defensives and self-healing as I might have had to in a Mythic Plus key. On a DPS character, it is much the same story, and I suspect that Hunters, Warlocks and DPS specs with good self-sustain will end up being perfectly okay as long as they're Mythic geared, but it's going to be pretty rough to go in solo at any gear level for less tanky classes like Shadow Priests or especially Mages. Reward-wise, the main draw seems to be Myth Track gear, which means yes, you will be able to obtain Myth Track gear from open world content in the new patch, but this comes with a pretty massive catch. It's going to require you 4 weeks to get just one item, meaning that with an 8-week patch cadence, you're only going to get 2. And these are going to be limited to the back belt or bracers slots. Now, I personally don't think that getting 2 Myth Track items, one of which will be in the last week of the season, is very exciting, especially as these are limited to slots that you can already craft Myth level gear into. Myth crests will be fairly readily available via level 6 ritual sites in patch 12.07, which along with the removal of that crest cap will allow us to freely upgrade other crest types. And that means that top rank crafted gear will be a lot more attainable for the majority of solo players. Personally, I think it would have been a lot better for these new items to be for the tier slots instead, which is a general rule you don't want to put crafted gear into, as we cannot catalyze crafted gear into tier. And I also think it would be a lot better to perhaps get 1 item every 2 weeks, which would give us 4 in total over the lifetime of that patch. Without those changes, right now I do question if this new heroic world tier will feel worth doing for many players, other than beyond completing the mini meta achievement, which does award a new mount. Now, content and reward tuning is often the last thing that the WoW dev team locks in, so it's very possible that this may still get changed. But if not, if it does go live like this, I would expect quite a bit of pushback from the player base, and likely either some significant buffs to rewards or perhaps a nerf to the difficulty level. There is a lot of merit to having an optional hard level of difficulty in the open world, and I like that Blizzard are testing this out. I just worry that if it doesn't end up feeling rewarding enough, it might not get the level of interest and participation it deserves, leading to the Blizzard devs learning the wrong lessons from what is a bit of an experiment. But going back to this week's PTR changes, and the first of these is the addition of some new ways to spend all of those dark particles that we're getting from running ritual sites and void assaults. Currently, the only thing that we can do with these is to turn in 100 for 10 field accolades. But now on the PTR, the patch 12.05 Transmog vendor has a brand new set of transmog pouches, which each cost 150 of these dark particles. These pouches will offer another way to obtain the weapon appearances that have an extremely low chance of showing up in those reward pouches that we get from doing the Void Assaults. But as these new vendor pouches guarantee you a transmog item every time, and you can also somewhat target the type of appearances you want, this is, I think, a much better way to farm for those looks. And that does mean that, especially as there will be several more ways to get field accolades in the new patch, you may want to start hoarding your dark particles instead of turning them in to the vendor. The other major change this week is a potential change to repair costs. There has been a lot of discussion in the community recently about rising repair bills, especially among people who raid log or perhaps only focus on doing other high level content, where gold is much harder to come by than it is from world quests and other open world content. On the latest PTR build, our weapons are no longer taking any damage while in combat. Now, just to recap on how damage to gear works, currently on the live game, our gear takes damage in two different ways. One is by a character dying, which causes around a 10% drop in durability across the board. And the other is from a very steady trickle of damage to our gear while we're in combat. On the PTR, our weapons are no longer taking that damage at all when we're in combat. And with weapons being one of the more expensive items to repair, especially for dual wielders or shield users, this does mean that we can all expect to see a modest drop in our repair bills. Now, this probably isn't going to be very impactful if you're progressing the end boss of a raid and wiping a lot. But for those of us who are just re-clearing or farming Mythic Plus for gear, where character deaths are much less frequent, it could be a pretty decent saving, though I'm not sure it's going to be enough to satisfy the people who don't want to go out there and farm some gold. That said, having a single gear slot no longer taking any damage at all is a little bit strange to me. And I cannot rule out the possibility that this could just be a PTR bug that ends up getting fixed. But if that does happen, I will be sure to let you know. Now, assuming that I am correct and the patch is coming out on June the 14th, given the recent player discussions about the overall quality of WoW's releases, with many people questioning if those quality issues are due to the 8-week release schedule, this does beg the question if we might end up seeing a repeat of patch 12.05. Now, it is worth saying that this new patch was very likely near completion when 12.05 came out, and I honestly think it's unrealistic to expect that any of the lessons the dev team have learned from 12.05 to feature in 12.07. So in many ways, this patch is very likely to be a steady as she goes type of patch. That said, as I've already mentioned, this patch does have fewer new features overall, which may well make testing and pre-launch bug fixing a lot easier than it was with 12.05. And if I was the World of Warcraft team's leaders, I would be moving heaven and earth to increase the amount of QA for this patch, perhaps even begging for some additional QA folks from some of the other Blizzard or even Microsoft gaming dev teams. That of course does assume that the WoW team's leadership does recognise that there is a systematic issue with the game's release quality. And whether that is the case or not, well, your guess is as good as mine, albeit the dev team's public statements on the patch's quality issues, be it the blue post or that Taliesin and Evitel interview, really didn't give me a lot of confidence that the team fully understand that patch 12.05 just wasn't a one-off blip. What I can say for certain is that if we do have another overly buggy release, the player backlash is going to be a lot louder and even more severe. Now personally, I would prefer WoW to be good, so I hope that doesn't turn out to be the case. Speaking longer term, I don't actually think that the issue with quality comes from the patch cadence itself, but instead I think it's coming from the amount of different features that the WoW team seem to be trying to ram into all of these minor 0.5 patches. And I'd personally like to see the WoW dev team focus on delivering a smaller number of features which benefit from more testing and indeed in many cases a bit more depth in gameplay. Imagine what that patch 11.15 Nightfall event could have been if all of the encounter design effort that was expended on dynamic duels had instead been spent on giving the Nightfall event a bigger variety of bosses and activities. Now there is one last bit of news that might well, over the longer term, start to help the dev team to move the game in the right direction. And that's the return of two pretty experienced former World of Warcraft developers back to the dev team. John Cash worked on World of Warcraft for about 7 years, from Mist of Pandaria through to Shadowlands, and was responsible for things like pet battles, Legion artifacts, class halls, and the Legion Argus patch, which is quite the CV, and he's recently announced his return to World of Warcraft development. In addition to that, Graham Berger, the combat designer who was heavily involved in the Dragonflight class talent trees rework and augmentation evoker, is also making a return to the team. Highly experienced previous World of Warcraft developers like these two bring a ton of not just OG knowledge about developing good content for the game, but also a lot of internalized lessons learned from the past. It's those memories of past issues and near misses that generally make experienced hires so valuable. In many cases, production bugs are avoided not through thorough testing, but through a grumpy senior dev asking just the right questions at just the right time. On top of this, an existing Blizzard QA analyst, GG Olivia, has just announced that he's moving over to join the WoW team. Now, I've no idea if this is a backfill for someone leaving the team or a new role, but either way, it is good to see that the QA team is being strengthened at a time when the quality of the game's releases is being questioned by the community. The lead time for game development is massive, so it's very likely that it is going to be a while before we players see the impact of these new hires, though they are no doubt already being felt within the dev team, and I certainly wish them, and indeed all of the World of Warcraft dev team, well in their efforts to get WoW's quality up to a level where it starts to match the quality of the gameplay that we've been seeing in Midnight. Gameplay-wise, World of Warcraft is moving in a very positive direction currently, and if the dev team can get the level of bugs back closer to what we were used to during the Legion and BFA era, I think that the immediate future of WoW could be pretty bright. Unfortunately though, there has been some less positive news in the wider World of Warcraft community. The site director of the popular community news and guide site Wowhead was laid off just over a week ago by Wowhead's parent company. Peculiar as Wowhead's site director, since, well, long before I started playing WoW back at the end of Legion, has been a major factor in how Wowhead got to its position as one of the best guide and news sites in any gaming community out there. Obviously, I do wish her well for the future, but at the same time, I cannot help but hold a lot of concern for the future of Wowhead. The truth is that written media, both print and online, has been struggling in the last decade, and recent developments in AI, especially AI-powered search, is only making things even more difficult for such sites, especially guide-driven sites like Wowhead. Many other similar sites have closed or merged in recent years, and that's often been accompanied by increasing use of low-quality clickbait and even AI slop articles. Now, I don't think that Wowhead is anywhere near that stage, at least for now, even though I do know that recently it did get some pushback over a couple of opinion piece articles that it released that didn't resonate with the community. Again, as with many things, only time is going to tell, but I am going to say one thing about it. If you're surprised by that talk of Wowhead having a parent company, it has been owned by large commercial publishers for a very long time, and its current parent, Zam Network, is itself owned by Chinese gaming giant Tencent, and it is they who hold the purse strings and ultimately control the future of the site. And I suspect that they'll only retain it as it is for as long as it makes them a profit to do so. Or in other words, if you want Wowhead and indeed Icy Veins to survive, use them or lose them. If we all start using those Google AI search summary boxes for our class guides instead of clicking through to the underlying websites, that's going to rob those sites of important revenue that they need to survive. And at the same time, you'll also be hurting yourself and your character's progress, as in my experience, so far the accuracy of those AI summaries is pretty terrible. And finally, for this week's update, this coming Monday is the 1st of June. Yes, we're almost halfway through 2026 already, and that does mean a brand new trading post and the usual Blizzard preview. This month's post is Tauren themed, with 2 brand new mounts as the centerpiece. The dust-painted Sunrock costs 700 traders tender, and the reward for filling the monthly Traveller's Log is yet another mount, the flame-painted Sunrock. There's also a couple of Tauren-themed ensembles, one of which has the most extreme big shoulders I've ever seen, and fans of totems are being catered to as well, albeit those totems can only be used in Tauren. And on that note, it is time to wind up for this week. I'd be super interested to hear your thoughts of patch 12.07. Are you ready for more content, or are you looking at that heroic world tier with a little bit of dread? Comment down below. If you found this update helpful, entertaining, or even just plain annoying, then let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel to grow and help me to make more of these videos along with other content, then hit that subscribe button right now before you forget. If you don't want to miss out whenever I release a new video, then as well as subscribing, you can follow me in social media for updates. My link's in the description below as well. I've also started streaming in Twitch on Wednesdays, Saturdays and Sundays, and you can find a link to my channel below, and I hope you'll be able to join me on my journey of exploration through midnight. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.